Good morning, guys. Am I audible? Okay, thank you. Now, we were talking about the Vijayanagar Empire. Most aspects of Vijayanagar history we have already completed, except for society and culture. Okay? So first we are going to address the Vijayanagar society. Now, society of the Vijayanagar Empire was a continuation of Tamil society of the Chola period. So, if you remember what we had covered under Chola society, basically वही practices, वही pattern यहाँ पे भी देखने के लिए मिलता है. That is, instead of a fourfold division Varna system, there was a twofold Varna division of the society, which was divided into the Brahmin Varna and the non-Brahmin Varna, right? However, Alasani Pedanna in his Manu Charitam talks about the existence of 4 caste groups which roughly follows the pattern of the fourfold Varna division: Brahmin, Vaishya, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra, right? नाम उसके अलग अलग हैं. So we get a contrasting picture over here, right? However, जो मनु चरितम है, that is considered to be a normative text, so it reflects the ideal situation. It does not necessarily reflect the situation at the ground level, the actual reality. ठीक है? Therefore, ये वाला जो idea है ना, that the South Indian society during Vijayanagar Empire was divided into twofold Varna system, that appears to be more valid over here. Apart from this, there were several caste groups as well. They were basically based on occupation, and they were largely grouped into 2 categories. Idangai, left-handed castes, and the Valangai or right-handed castes. ठीक है? Untouchability existed, with several castes being considered untouchables by the society, right? अलग अलग नाम है. Mainly they came from the impure group of castes or the left-handed caste, the Valangai castes. At the same time, Brahmins enjoyed a great degree of privilege and prestige in the society. Not only were they in charge of their traditional educational and priestly roles, they also made important sections of the ruling class. So even governance was in their hand. All the kings, the top military officials, Amar Nayakas, their advisors, they all came from Brahmin background. They were also in charge of regulating religious as well as educational activities within the kingdom. The condition of women was quite poor. They were subjected to social evils such as dowry, child marriage, sati, disinheritance, widow remarriages were not acceptable within the society. And temples emerged as an arena for the sexual exploitation of women through the Devdasi system. The majority of women were also denied education. On the other hand, we also see how in some respects the condition of women was better than their contemporaries in the north. Farano Nunez, for example, talks about the existence of educated women who were scholars, astronomers, astrologers, soothsayers, advisors and scribes. Women also participated in cultural activities such as music, dance and drama. Further, there were women wrestlers and warriors. In fact, a portion of the royal bodyguard was constituted of only women. While widow remarriage was banned in the eyes of the society, it was prohibited in the eyes of the society, the state encouraged widow remarriages through tax exemptions. Okay? And thus it appears that the condition of women, although it was poor, was still relatively better as compared to women in North India at the same point of time. Slavery was existed and was widespread. Niccolò Conti observes that those who failed to repay their debts were automatically enslaved. So they had to work off their debt. Insolvent debtors were enslaved automatically. Further, within the city of Vijayanagar, various travelers observed the presence of a slave market in which a large variety of slaves meant for different purposes were sold. They belonged to various racial and religious groups. Enslaving prisoners of war was a common practice. At the same time, slaves could purchase their freedoms by paying their masters. Slaves were also allowed to marry, and the children of slaves were born free. Some slaves were also imported primarily by people who captured and traded in slaves in the Persian Gulf region, right? So some Arab slave traders also operated in Vijayanagar. When it came to the religious environment, there is no doubt that the state patronized Hindu culture by constructing large temples, endowing them with massive grants of land, by encouraging the religious scholars and other articles of Hindu culture. However, there was no discrimination against non-Hindus. Religious minorities enjoyed complete freedom and protection from the state. The Vijayanagar Empire also employed several thousand Muslim soldiers they openly traded Arabs, Persians, and the Portuguese. And overall, the state exhibited a highly tolerant religious attitude. ठीक है? The education system was primarily regulated through which institutions? Through temples and mathas. The temples received lavish grants from the state to maintain schools. The curriculum consisted of a mixture of religious and secular education. Religious education being the study of the Vedas, Purans, epics, and various commentaries on these works, along with the Dharma Shastras and religious philosophy. Secular education constituted mathematics, grammar, astronomy, medicine, and some other physical and natural sciences, along with attention towards vocational education as well. In these temples, obviously, only a small section of the population would be admitted entry, and they would be expected to perform the higher vocations, those of administrators, warriors, etc. Right? तो यहाँ पे किस तरह का स्किल इम्पार्ट किया जाएगा? एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव एंड military training. Both theoretical and practical education was given over here. Access to education was limited. It was accessible only to the upper caste men. Lower castes and women were not allowed to receive education. another important institution which was involved in education was the trade guild. So trade guilds were generally organized around various activities, economic activities. कुछ traders guild होंगी, for example oil traders की, cotton traders की, silk traders की. Some guilds would be organized around certain crafts, for example textile manufacturing, brick making, architecture, sculpture, etc., pottery, right? Now these trade guilds also performed an important role in training the new inductees in the various techniques of the profession. Trained apprentices. ठीक है, तो ये एक पिक्चर दिख गया है एजुकेशन का. क्लियर? एंड दिस गिव्स अस अ होलिस्टिक पिक्चर ऑफ द विजयनगर society. Take down a question. Delineate the essential characteristics of the Vijayanagar society. Would it be correct to say that it was at the cusp of modernity? Do you understand this question? It was at the cusp of modernity. CUSP, cusp of modernity. क्वेश्चन समझ में आया है? दो पोर्शन में है. पहला वाला तो केवल फीचर्स बताने हैं विजयनगर सोसाइटी के, अलग अलग कैरेक्टरिस्टिक्स. दूसरे वाले में you need to judge whether it could be considered to be a society which was at the cusp of modernity. वो मॉडर्नाइज होने के जस्ट पहले वाली स्टेज तक पहुंच चुका था. सो इट वाज ट्रांसफॉर्मिंग. ऐसा कहना सही होगा या नहीं सही होगा? ठीक है, तो लेट अस ट्राई टू आंसर दिस क्वेश्चन इन द फॉर्म ऑफ एन आंसर. यू कैन राइट डाउन. The Vijayanagar society presents an interesting study of a society, of a medieval society in South India under a Hindu power, at a time when Islamic power was expanding across India. ठीक है, तो इस तरह से आप इंट्रोड्यूस कर सकते हो. नेक्स्ट लिखो. द मेन फीचर्स of the Vijayanagar society are as follows. Number 1, the society was hierarchical and theoretically based on the ancient Varnashram Dharma system. On the Varnashram, theoretically based on the ancient Varnashram Dharma system. ठीक है? Next point, sorry, sub point. However, unlike North India, it appears that instead of a fourfold societal division, comma, there was a twofold division of the society. With Brahmins constituting the privileged class and non-Brahmins constituting the privileged class and non-Brahmins constituting the common class. Full stop. अगला सब point, non-Brahmins constituting the common class. Next sub point, the Brahmins enjoyed supreme position and had both political power and social prestige. Next sub point, the king, top officials, military commanders, provincial governors, ministers, etc. were all Brahmin. Provincial governors, ministers, etc. were all Brahmin. Next sub point, Brahmin priests were rewarded with extensive land grants. Full stop. Next sub point, educational institutions were also under their complete control. Full stop. Religious life. Next sub point, religious life was characterized by excessive ritualism, resulting in was characterized by extensive ritualism और excessive ritualism, resulting in, क्या रिजल्ट होगा इसका? डोमिनेशन ऑफ विच ग्रुप? priestly class, brahmanical priestly class, resulting in the domination of the brahmanical priestly class, the brahmanical priestly class. नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. Contrary to this fourfold division, contrary to this twofold division, comma, Allasani Pedanna in his Manu Charitam Pedanna, he was one of the Ashtadikgajas. Ashtadikgajas कौन थे? 8 great Telugu scholars in the court of कृष्ण देव राय. जैसे अकबर के नवरत्न थे ना, वैसे ही कृष्ण देव राय के अष्टदिग्गजास थे. अष्ट is 8 and दिग्गज is elephant or a giant. So these were the 8 literary giants. उनमें से एक थे अल्लासानी पेदन्ना. Contrary to this twofold division, Allasani Pedanna in his Manu Charitam mentions the presence of 4 caste groups. 4 caste groups. Sub point number 1. इसी में विप्रुलु और ब्राह्मण who followed the traditional professions of teaching and priesthood. Teaching and priesthood. ठीक है. Sometimes, full stop, sometimes they also performed the roles of administrators and soldiers. Administrators or soldiers. ठीक है. Their privileged position, हाँ इसी में ही, their privileged position is confirmed by foreign travelers such as, किसने मेंशन किया है इनके बारे में, किसने बात करी है? Domingo Pais, such as Domingo Pais. ठीक है. तो ये हो गए विप्रुलु और ब्राह्मण. नेक्स्ट राजुलु और रावाचारू. राजुलु और रावाचारू कौन होंगे? ruling class, right? So write down, they were generally associated with the ruling class. ठीक है, full stop. Since the Kshatriya Varna seems to be absent in South India, since the Kshatriya Varna seems to be absent in South India, comma, rulers were actually Brahmin, but were referred to as Ravacharu, but were referred to as Ravacharu due to their position, due to their position. ठीक है, थर्ड, मटी का रतालू और वैश्यास. They generally observed which profession? They generally observed. अरे वैश्यास क्या होते थे? Traders. They generally observed the trading profession. The trading profession. ठीक है. And fourth, नलव जाति वारू, NALAVAJATIVARU, और शूद्रास. Who were they? Mainly agriculturalists. Write down, they were mainly agriculturalists. But also performed certain certain professions. Performed की जगह पे pursued certain professions, especially crafts production, They were considered to be inferior. ठीक है, इज दिस क्लियर? नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो, जो 4 है ना उसके बाद 5 नहीं लिखना, नहीं इसका नहीं, जो हाँ मेन सीरीज चल रहा था उसका सब पॉइंट. अरे मनुचरितम जो बताया था आपको उसका सब पॉइंट लिखो. नेक्स्ट, अल्लासानी पेदन्नाज classification of the society appears to be a normative one, appears to be a normative one. Full stop. He was probably giving his thoughts on the ideal society, on the ideal society. Full stop. सब पॉइंट इसके अंदर. ओवरऑल comma, the society primarily consisted of Brahmins and non-Brahmins. Society primarily consisted of Brahmins and non-Brahmins, with the जो non-Brahmins हैं, with the latter being segregated into various castes on the basis of profession, on the basis of occupation, ठीक है. Next main point number 2. The society, especially non-Brahmins, were subdivided into several caste groups on the basis of occupation, full stop. Sub point. These groups were rigid and assigned at birth. So was occupational mobility, economic mobility possible or impossible? Largely impossible. Very few instances where people were allowed to undertake professions outside their caste identity. Okay. Next sub point. These castes were organized hierarchically, and could be broadly categorized into two groups. Idangai, the left-handed castes, and Valangai, the right-handed castes. Idangai left-handed, Valangai right-handed castes. बताओ इनमें से ज्यादा सुपीरियर कौन सा माना जाएगा? Valangai right-handed, right? Write down. Valangai castes, हाँ सेम या सब पॉइंट लिख सकते हो, सब पॉइंट. Valangai castes were considered to be superior to the Idangai castes. And what was the basis for this hierarchical division of the caste system? Why were one group of castes considered superior and one inferior? On the basis of purity and pollution. Some professions were considered to be clean and some to be unclean. Therefore, people who were associated with these were also similarly considered to be clean and unclean. अनटचेबल ग्रुप्स आपको किन में से देखने के लिए मिलेंगे? इदंगई में से देखने के लिए मिलेंगे, नॉट वलंगई. नाउ व्हाट इज द जनरल पैटर्न ऑफ अनटचेबिलिटी इन इंडिया? कल्टीवेटर ग्रुप्स को अनटचेबल्स करार दिया जाता है या फिर जो क्राफ्ट प्रोड्यूसर्स हैं उनको? ज्यादातर क्राफ्ट प्रोडक्शन के साथ जो एसोसिएटेड होते हैं, especially those crafts which are considered to be unclean because of some social taboos, some pejoratives, etc. ठीक है, write down next point. The society, हाँ थर्ड नंबर, the society, नहीं थर्ड नंबर का पॉइंट नहीं, ये सब पॉइंट, नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट. The society was highly conscious of the ideas of purity and pollution, of purity and pollution. And this became the basis for social division as well, for social division as well. Full stop. Idangai castes generally associated with craft production were considered impure, were considered impure. Full stop. On the other hand, the Valangai castes generally associated with agriculture were considered clean, were considered clean. ठीक है, ये हो गया है कास्ट का प्रोलिफरेशन. नेक्स्ट नंबर 3, अनटचेबिलिटी. Untouchability was widespread and several groups such as Kambalattars, Dambars and Jogis were considered to be untouchables, were considered to be untouchables. Full stop. In the eyes of the society, in the eyes of the society, members of these groups were seen as unclean, were seen as unclean. And were subjected to brutal segregation and discrimination, to brutal segregation and discrimination. Discrimination. So there were both written and unwritten rules prohibiting interaction with members of these groups, especially for members of the upper caste, the Brahmin group. No interdining, no intermarriage. They were not allowed to live in the same location. They were not allowed to enter into a new profession. They were forced to live in a confined space. They were heavily discriminated against. They were not given access to पब्लिक रोड्स, टेम्पल्स में एंट्री बैंड था, एजुकेशन नहीं अलाउड था, पब्लिक वेल से पानी नहीं ड्रॉ कर सकते थे. दीज काइंड्स ऑफ थिंग्स वर दे वर एक्सपीरियंसिंग. ठीक है, तो दिस इज नंबर 4. नेक्स्ट राइट नंबर नंबर 3 हुआ ना अभी. नंबर 4, कंडीशन ऑफ विमेन. द कंडीशन ऑफ विमेन was poor, but it appeared to be relatively better than that of women in North India. In North India. Subpoint. Women were subjected to a series of social evils such as dowry, child marriage, sati. Sati was also known by other names such as Tippadiyal and Sagman, Saghaman. This is in the context of Vijayanagar only. Tippadiyal was also a term used for sati during the Chola period. ठीक है, और Sagmana is particular to the Vijayanagar period. Sati, comma, denial of inheritance and education, comma, sexual exploitation in temples through the Devdasi system, and the brutal social exclusion of widows who were prohibited. Social exclusion of widows who were prohibited from remarrying. Is this clear? Next subpoint. On the other hand, comma, contrasting information has also emerged. The Portuguese traveler Ferrano Nunes reports the presence of highly educated women, highly educated women performing the roles of scholars, scribes, astronomers, fortune tellers, musicians, singers, dancers, fortune tellers, musicians, singers, dancers, painters, wrestlers, and even warriors. And even warriors. Next subpoint. The state also attempted to improve the condition of widows by legally recognizing their right to remarry and encouraging the remarriage of widows through tax exemptions. क्लियर है? 4 हो गए. Number 5, slavery existed and was widespread in the Vijayanagara Empire. Full stop. Subpoint. Foreign travelers such as Abdur Razak and 𝐂𝐭 𝐭𝐡 attest to the presence of a large slave market in Vijayanagara, where slaves from different parts of the world were sold and purchased in large quantities. Next subpoint. 𝐂𝐭 𝐭𝐡 informs us that those who were unable to pay debts, their debts were enslaved. Stop. Next subpoint. Enslavement of prisoners of war was also a common practice. prisoners of war was also a common practice. Next sub point. Slaves were used for a variety of functions. Ranging from domestic to agricultural labor, domestic and agricultural labor, to military service, administrative assistance, and crafts production. Full stop. Next sub point. Educated slaves were in high demand, especially among members of which group? Especially among highly educated slaves. कौन किसको जरूरत होगी? हाँ, रूलिंग क्लास. ठीक है, स्पेशली among the ruling class. ओके, नेक्स्ट पॉइंट लिखो. हाँ, मतलब इसी में ही, स्लेवरी के अंदर ही अगला पॉइंट. एट द सेम टाइम the condition of slaves in Vijayanagar was far better than European or Turkish slaves. So at this point of time, mid 14 से लेकर के mid 17th century तक, 16th century तक, slavery was also widespread in that part of the world, Ottoman Empire and the various kingdoms of Europe. However, this condition of slaves in Vijayanagar was far better than those regions. Sub point लिखो. Slaves had the opportunity to work off their debts, and purchase their freedom. Full stop. Sub point. Next sub point. Slave owners were not permitted to kill their slaves. Without a proper judicial process. Kill their slaves without a proper judicial process. Next point. Slaves were allowed to marry. And their children were born free. Next sub point. The child of a female slave and her male master had the right to inherit his father's property. His father's property. ठीक है. और जब ऐसा सिचुएशन होता था तो the female slave was also automatically freed as soon as she bore a child to her male master. ठीक है. अच्छा, तो ये हो गया स्लेवरी. कितने हो गए? 5 6 5. नेक्स्ट राइट, नंबर 6, रिलीजियस एनवायरनमेंट. लिखो. The rulers of Vijayanagar were undoubtedly great patrons of the Hindu faith. Great patrons. The rulers of Vijayanagar were undoubtedly great patrons of the Hindu faith and culture. Of the Hindu faith and culture. Full stop. They constructed monumental temples, comma, endowed them with huge land grants, comma, frequently rewarded the priestly class by donating them land, comma, encouraged the construction of temples even in remote areas, comma, projected themselves as the protectors of the Hindu faith, comma, Brahmins and cows. So one of their common titles was Hindu Dharmodharaka. Another common title was Gau Brahman Pratipalaka. Right? They projected themselves as protectors of Brahmins, cows and the Hindu faith. Full stop. Sorry, comma. Richly patronized religious scholarship and philosophy, and positioned themselves against the rise of Islamic power in the south. So they deliberately positioned themselves as the ones who were responsible for keeping Islam at bay, for keeping Islam contained. ठीक है. Next sub point लिखो. At the same time, there was no discrimination against non-Hindus. full stop. Religious minorities enjoyed complete freedom and protection. Minorities enjoyed complete freedom and protection. Next point. The Vijayanagar army consisted of several thousand Muslim soldiers. And the people of Vijayanagar traded openly with Arabs, Persians and the Portuguese. With Arabs, Persians and the Portuguese. Full stop. Next point. Overall, the religious environment was one of toleration and peaceful coexistence. Peaceful coexistence. Full stop. Next point. At the same time, during wars against the Bahmani Sultanate, रिलीजन के नाम पे खून खराबा होता था या नहीं होता था? रिलीजियस एक्सेसेस were carried out by both sides. ठीक है, ये हो गया रिलीजियस एनवायरनमेंट. नेक्स्ट एजुकेशन. कौन सा है? नंबर 7 एजुकेशन. Full stop. The education system of the Vijayanagar Empire was largely a continuation of the existing system. Largely a continuation of the existing system. Full stop. It was primarily regulated through temples and mathas. It was primarily regulated through temples and mathas. Full stop. The state, next point, the state encouraged education by promoting the construction of temples even in remote areas and making lavish grants even in remote areas and making lavish grants to them for the maintenance of schools. ठीक है. Next point. The curriculum consisted of a mixture of religious and secular learning. Full stop. Sub point. Religious education. Religious education involved the reading of the Vedas, Purans, epics and Dharmashastras, comma, commentaries on these works and commentaries on these works and religious philosophy. Religious philosophy. Next subpoint. Secular education consisted of a mixture of literary and vocational training. Literary and vocational training. Rather, you can write academic and vocational training. That would be better. Academic and vocational training. Academic and vocational training. Subpoint. Academic education included mathematics, astronomy, grammar, medicine, physics, and other natural sciences. Vocational training, full stop, subpoint. Vocational training, next subpoint. Vocational training included the practical aspects of political and military education. The practical and theoretical aspects of political and military education. Political and military education. The practical and theoretical aspects of political and military education. Full stop. Next subpoint. Traditionally, education was imparted in which language? In Sanskrit. But during the Vijayanagara Empire, other languages, other regional languages also emerged as not only fields of study but also mediums of instruction. Instruction. Which was the most prominent among these? देखो, तमिल और कन्नड़ा में तो पहले से एजुकेशन दिया जा रहा था. तमिल since the Chola period and Kannada since the Rashtrakuta period. अब फोकस किसकी तरफ होगा? तेलुगु, ठीक है। तो राइट डाउन, क्या लिखा है अभी आपने? इंस्ट्रक्शन। नोटेबल अमंग देम, नोटेबल अमंग देम was Telugu, was Telugu, full stop. The Vijayanagar period constituted a golden age for Telugu literary and educational development. Telugu literary and educational development. Educational development. Next सब point लिखो. Although the number of temple run schools increased substantially, comma, the access to education remained rather narrow. The access to education remained rather narrow. The access to education remained rather narrow. Full stop. Women and the lower castes, women and the lower castes were excluded from education, were excluded from education, except for a few exceptions, except for a few exceptions. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट सब पॉइंट लिखो. ट्रेड guilds also performed an important educational function, an important educational function. Full stop. सब पॉइंट सॉरी इसी में ही लिखो. apprentices were given necessary skills and training, necessary skills and training in their respective professions, in their respective professions. By the guilds themselves, by the guilds themselves. Is this clear? ये हो गए essential features of the Vijayanagar society, essential characteristics of the Vijayanagar society. Conclusion में लिख सकते हो. Thus, the Vijayanagar society represents a vibrant, dynamic and cosmopolitan society, and cosmopolitan society. Which appears distinct from the general social trend in the rest of India. in the rest of India. Trend in the rest of India. ठीक है? However, the society was not free of limitations. Was not free of limitations. कुछ limitations थी या नहीं थी? बिल्कुल थी, राइट? और अब हमको क्या करना है? इन्हीं limitations को highlight करना है so that we can address the next portion of the equation. Was the society actually at the cusp of modernity or not? Write down. These include number 1. बताओ क्या क्या? The presence of a rigid varna and caste based hierarchical division of society in which social and physical mobility, economic mobility were highly restricted. ठीक है? Write down. The presence of rigid varna and caste based divisions with highly restricted physical, social and economic mobility. Physical, social and economic mobility. जो बेसिस फॉर हायरार्किकल डिवीजन है सोसाइटी का, इज इट रैशनल और इरैशनल? इरैशनल था. कैसे बोल सकते हैं इरैशनल था? अरे भाई, किसी इंसान का प्रोफेशन क्या उसको प्योर या इम्प्योर बना सकता है? नहीं. रैशनल सिस्टम में क्या होता? दैट मार्केट डायनामिक्स वुड हैव डोमिनेटेड द सोशल इक्वेशन. Whichever service was more valuable, its practitioner would be given a higher social status. ऐसा हो रहा था? नहीं हो रहा था. Write down. हाँ. The second, the basis for social division and organization was a highly irrational one. Full stop. The society was based upon notions such as purity and pollution, which were not conducive to a progressive outlook. ठीक है? और क्या खामियां थी सोसाइटी की? बताओ. Large chunks of the population were condemned to a life of constant and permanent indignity. These were the untouchables. उनको lowest of the low social exclusion face करना पड़ता था. Religious disabilities, political disabilities पे subject किया जाता था. Economic restrictions were extremely high on them. They were considered to be impure. They were stigmatized as well. Deliberate distancing was maintained. ठीक है? Write down. A large chunk of the population a large chunk of the population within brackets the untouchables were condemned to a life of permanent indignity, were condemned to a life of permanent indignity. मॉडर्न सोसाइटी में क्या होता है? पॉलिटिकल एसोसिएशन इंडिविजुअल बेसिस पे होता है या ग्रुप बेसिस पर? इंडिविजुअल बेसिस पर होता है, तभी ना बात करते हो इंडिविजुअल फ्रीडम, ह्यूमन डिग्निटी, डिग्निटी ऑफ द इंडिविजुअल. व्हाई आर यू डूइंग दिस? क्योंकि ये मॉडर्न सिस्टम है. यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है? इंडिविजुअल बेसिस पे पॉलिटिक्स या ग्रुप बेसिस पे पॉलिटिक्स? Is a particular individual being judged by the content of his character or simply his surname, his caste? Simply his surname or caste. So once again a pre-modern way of thinking. Write down. हाँ, इसी point में this group based political and social discrimination was distinctly pre-modern. ठीक है. और क्या कमियां थी? How do modern societies treat their women? क्या दर्जा दिया जाता है? As equal members of the society, individual women are given their human rights are recognized, their individual dignity is safeguarded, is guaranteed, their identity is protected, so their identity is not subjected to their male relations. Can the same be said about the Vijayanagar society, women in the Vijayanagar society? No. So write down. Number 4, women were also subjected to a number of indignities and disabilities. Full stop. A society that discriminates so heavily on the basis of gender cannot be considered, which discriminates so heavily on the basis of gender cannot be considered a modern one. ठीक है. कितने 4 हुए? नेक्स्ट नंबर 5. How would you describe the policy of the Vijayanagar rulers? Completely secular or partly secular? Partly secular. Religion continued to loom large in the political apparatus, in the political environment. Although the Vijayanagar rulers adopted a more tolerant stance than their contemporaries, but religion still continued to dominate political life. कई बार रिलीजन की बेसिस पे ही खून खराबा भी होता था. देयर वाज अ लॉट ऑफ ब्लड लेटिंग आल्सो. द स्टेट आल्सो रिलाइड अपॉन इट्स रिलीजियस आइडेंटिटी इन ऑर्डर टू गेन लेजिटिमेसी, इन ऑर्डर टू लेजिटिमाइज एंड फर्दर एक्सपैंड इट्स कंट्रोल. ठीक है. तो इज दिस अ सिम्पटम of a rational modern society or a pre-rational pre-modern pre-rational society? Pre-rational pre-modern society. Write down. The state remained heavily reliant upon religion. The state remained heavily reliant upon religion to draw its legitimacy, and power, full stop. This once again is a distinctly pre-modern trait. This once again is a distinctly pre-modern trait. T-R-A-I-T, pre-modern trait. 5 हुए. Next, write number 6. The education system of Vijayanagar, उसमें क्या limitations थे? It also had a heavy dose of religious learning. So it was in fact done within the framework of religion. Who was in charge of education activities? Priests. कहाँ पर schools कहाँ थे सारे? Controlled by temples. And thus जो secular education चाहिए for a society to transform into a truly modern society, वो यहाँ पे available नहीं था. जो secular education मिल भी रहा था, that was based on a very old understanding of these traditional subjects. Mathematics हो गए, grammar हो गया, वो कम से कम 1000 साल पुराना हो चुका था. There was a great degree of stagnation. कोई modernity, कोई progress उसमें नहीं देखने के लिए मिल रहा था. ठीक है, क्या लिखा अभी आपने? और विजयनगर was not only dominated by religion, but was also a stagnant one. ठीक है, it could not be characterized as a modern progressive education system. ठीक है, और कोई कमी? The presence of widespread slavery in Vijayanagar. Slavery is one of the greatest sins ever possible. Why? Because it deprives an individual of their free will. They are subjected to the will of another, and this goes against every precept of human right and human dignity. ठीक है, it is even against the core religious philosophy of all major religions. Right? Write down. Number 7. The widespread prevalence of slavery was also a distinctly medieval characteristic. Full stop. Slavery deprived the individual of their free will. And thus stands in contravention to every principle of human rights, individualism, and the principles of natural justice. The principles of natural justice. ठीक है? तो बताओ, could you consider the Vijayanagar society to be at the cusp of modernity? नहीं, अभी तक जो हमने देखा है उसके बेसिस पे तो नहीं बोल सकते. Now, although Vijayanagar Empire, Vijayanagar society had all these limitations, had all these problems, did it also not have some redeeming features? कुछ improvements visible थे या नहीं थे? थे. Write down. Next paragraph. At the same time, comma, the Vijayanagar society was witnessing significant improvements. किस तरह के improvements? Write down number 1. The rulers did not discriminate on the basis of varna and caste. Varna and caste. When promoting merit and talent, especially in the cultural fields. कैसे बोल सकते हैं हम? डोमिंगो पेज ने बोला है that many of the artists, painters, architects, dancers, musicians, singers at the court in Vijayanagar came from the lower caste, so called lower castes. ठीक है, तो राजा लोग इनके ये जो कल्चरल टैलेंट्स है उनको अप्रिशिएट करते थे. ऐसा नहीं कि दैट बिकॉज दे बिलोंग टू अ लोअर कास्ट दे वर नॉट परमिटेड टू कम टू कोर्ट, राइट? दैट वाज नॉट द केस. दूसरा, सेकंड, the state also initiated active measures to improve the condition of women. Active measures to improve the condition of women, primarily widows. किया कि नहीं किया? बिल्कुल किया. थर्ड, the state also ensured that slaves were treated fairly and justly. Fairly and leniently, you should write. Fairly and leniently. Number 4, by encouraging the spread of education, comma, the state attempted to induce a new energy. In the native systems of learning. Number 5, the rulers exhibited remarkable religious tolerance, exhibited remarkable religious tolerance that was fitting for any modern administrator, that was fitting for any modern administrator. मॉडर्न एडमिनिस्ट्रेटर. कितने पॉइंट लिखे हैं आपने? 5. इन पांचों में आपको कुछ सिमिलैरिटी दिख रहा है, कुछ कॉमन पॉइंट दिख रहा है? हु इज इन्वॉल्व ओवर हियर? ऑलवेज स्टेट का रोल है, रूलिंग क्लास का रोल है. सोसाइटी एट लार्ज, उसका कोई डायरेक्ट रोल है? नहीं है. एंड ये जो चेंजेस हैं, आर दे सिग्निफिकेंट इनफ टू so that we can say that the Vijayanagar society was at the very cusp of modernity, at the very brink of modernity, या फिर modernization का process अभी state ने शुरू किया था, बस अभी तो शुरुआत हुई है, right? खत्म नहीं होने वाला है, वो stage पहुंच नहीं गए हैं, right? Write down next main point. नहीं, 6 point नहीं, अगला paragraph लिख सकते हो. On the basis of the above observations, on the basis of the above observations, it becomes clear that while the state had initiated the process of social and religious reforms, this क्या लिखा है? had initiated the process of social and religious reform, it was still in its nativity, ठीक है, अभी अभी पैदा हुआ था ये प्रोसेस, खत्म नहीं हुआ था. राइट डाउन, फुल स्टॉप. इट वॉज नोवेयर क्लोज टू बीइंग finished. It was nowhere close to being finished. Full stop. Thus, it may be concluded that Vijayanagar had simply taken the first step towards modernity, or the Vijayanagar ruling class had simply taken the first step towards modernity. With the society simply taken the ruling class had simply taken the first step towards modernity, and the society was lagging far behind. Society was lagging far behind. ठीक है, इसको आप एक और लेंस से देख सकते हो. हाउ डिड यूरोप मॉडर्नाइज? व्हाट वाज द फर्स्ट स्टेप टुवर्ड्स दैट? यूरोप की मॉडर्नाइजेशन में पहला स्टेप क्या हुआ? अरे मेडिवल से मॉडर्न एज में आए तो क्या वो डिमार्केटिंग लाइन कौन सा मूवमेंट होता है? विच इंटेलेक्चुअल मूवमेंट? Renaissance. Now, was Renaissance state-led movement, or was it an intellectual movement that was the result of a general transformation of the society, of the economy, society and political system, which then translated into a new intellectual understanding. तो उसका बेस नीचे से पहले बना एंड बाहर आकर के इट मैनिफेस्टेड इटसेल्फ इन द फॉर्म ऑफ न्यू आइडियाज, इन द फॉर्म ऑफ एन इंटेलेक्चुअल मूवमेंट, राइट. यहां पे क्या हो रहा है? The ruling class is exhibiting a modern mindset, but the society at large is not responding to it, क्योंकि वो जो necessary socio economic और political transformation है वो lower levels पे हुआ ही नहीं है. Is this clear? Write down. एक जनरल नोट लिख सकते हो बॉक्स में. कंपैरिजन बिटवीन Europe and Vijayanagar. That when you revise it, it becomes even clearer. ठीक है, लिखो. The modernization of Europe, the modernization of Europe was brought about by was brought about not by was brought about with the Renaissance, with the Renaissance, full stop. It was an intellectual movement, it was an intellectual movement that represented a complete transformation, a complete transformation of European consciousness, of European consciousness. Full stop. It was based upon a general transformation of the European economy, polity and society from the 14th century onwards. And the ideas associated with the Renaissance represented the final stage of its manifestation, represented the final stage of its manifestation. ठीक है, फुल स्टॉप. अगला पैराग्राफ या पॉइंट जैसे भी लिख रहे हो आप. On the other hand, Vijayanagar did not experience any similar. Vijayanagar did not experience any similar socio-economic or political transformation. Socio-economic and political transformation. Full stop. Therefore, the reformative projects of the rulers did not resonate strongly with the general population, with the general population. full stop. Next point in next paragraph. In other words, while the European Renaissance was a bottom-up process, the modernity project of the Vijayanagara rulers was a bottom-up project, the क्या लिखा है? Modernity project of the Vijayanagara rulers was a top-down phenomena. समझ में आया ना? ये पूरा कॉन्टेक्स्ट समझ में आ गया इस क्वेश्चन का? क्या क्या आर्गुमेंट्स आप कर सकते हो? अलग अलग डायमेंशन सोसाइटी के याद रहेंगे, 6-7 डायमेंशन हमने कवर किए हैं. लिमिटेशंस ऑफ विजयनगर सोसाइटी, रिडीमिंग फीचर्स ऑफ विजयनगर सोसाइटी, उसमें कौन मेजर रोल प्ले कर रहा था, एंड व्हाई इट शुड नॉट बी कंसिडर्ड टू हैव brought the society on the cusp of modernity. Then comparison between European Renaissance and the modernity project of the Vijayanagar ruling class. ठीक है? तो ये क्वेश्चन delineate the essential characteristics of the Vijayanagar society, and would it be correct to say that it was at the cusp of modernity in 200 words? कर लोगे? ठीक है. हाँ, ये नोट आई डोंट नो कि इस क्वेश्चन में आप उसको लगा सकते हो, बट इट इज वेरी यूजफुल टू कंपेयर एंड कंट्रास्ट. ठीक है, तो ये आपको एक क्लियर पिक्चर बताने के लिए है कि मॉडर्निटी जब आती है, जैसे यूरोप में आई, तो उसके सही मायने क्या होते हैं. इट इज नॉट सिंपली द एक्टिविटीज ऑफ द रूलिंग क्लास विच आर रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर मॉडर्नाइजिंग द सोसाइटी, रादर इट नीड्स टू बी अ बॉटम अप फिनोमेना. ठीक है, कि नीचे से शुरुआत हो, सो दैट पूरा का पूरा जो एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव, पॉलिटिकल, इकोनॉमिक एंड सोशल हायरार्की है देयर इंस्टीट्यूशंस, दे आर फोर्स्ड टू मॉडर्नाइज. राइट, ऊपर से अगर इंपोज करने की कोशिश करोगे एंड पीपल आर नॉट गोइंग टू रिस्पॉन्ड टू इट, देन द मॉडर्नाइजिंग प्रोजेक्ट्स आर गोइंग टू बी लार्जली इनइफेक्टिव. एक राजा आएगा, वो कुछ चेंजेस करने की कोशिश करेगा, मे बी इन हिज टाइम उसका कुछ इफेक्ट हो, एज सून एज ही डाइज दैट इज ऑल गोइंग टू बी फॉरगॉटन. So in the case of Vijayanagar, that is what happened. Europe में Renaissance आया, which was a bottom-up process. So if you are approaching the question with this understanding, you would be able to write it better. So that was my purpose behind giving you this short note. Take down another question. Vijayanagar rulers were unable to bring about any drastic social changes analyze. What is the demand of the question? किसके बारे में बात करनी है आपको? Mainly the factors behind the failure of Vijayanagar rulers to bring about a radical social revolution. इसके बारे में जनरली आपको बात करनी. ठीक है, बताओ क्या फैक्टर्स थे? कोशिश करी या नहीं करी इन्होंने? की। किस तरह से कोशिश करी? तो जो 5 पॉइंट बताए थे आपको कि कुछ इंप्रूवमेंट करने की कोशिश करी, तो वहां उस तरह से आप बोल सकते हो कि हाँ, दे मेड सम अटेम्प्ट टू रिफॉर्म दी सोसाइटी, बट व्हाई डिड दे फेल? वर दे एक्चुअली ट्राइंग टू ब्रिंग अबाउट अ रैडिकल सोशल रेवोल्यूशन? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल पहले तो ये जानना है, या फिर उनका ऑब्जेक्टिव कुछ और था? It was simply to reform and not revolutionize. ठीक है, तो इफ दे ट्राइड टू मेक इंप्रूवमेंट्स, तो कहां पे इंप्रूवमेंट्स किए उन्होंने? डिड दे ट्राई टू अंडू द ब्राह्मणिकल डोमिनेशन ऑफ सोसाइटी? नहीं, क्योंकि पता था कि अगर वो करोगे तो दे आर गोइंग टू लूज लेजिटिमेसी. सेकेंडली, दे आर गोइंग टू वीकन देयर ओन क्लेम टू द थ्रोन. क्यों? बिकॉज दे ऑल्सो बिलोंग टू द ब्राह्मणिकल ग्रुप. Thirdly, they were getting a lot of support from other powerful groups, other powerful individuals who all belong to the Brahminical group. The Brahminical group was entrenched. It was in charge of not only political but also religious and educational life. It was the intellectual leader of the realm, and therefore any attempt to suppress their power and their privilege would have had a drastic negative reaction, which could have challenged the authority of the Vijayanagar or ended the authority of the Vijayanagar rulers themselves. So their attempt was to reform and not revolutionize, first of all. दूसरा बताओ और क्या फैक्टर्स? अरे भाई, डिड देयर एजेंडा हैव एनी वाइड स्प्रेड सोशल एक्सेप्टेबिलिटी या फिर नहीं था? Why was Renaissance successful and why were they not successful? अभी हमने डिस्कस किया ना कि वहां पे the accompanying socio-economic and political changes had already taken place. विजयनगर में नहीं हुए थे. The Vijayanagar society, economy and polity was distinctly medieval. It was never going to resonate powerfully with a modernity project. This was another major reason for its failure. ठीक है, तीसरा बताओ. What were the circumstances of the creation of the Vijayanagar Empire? कैसे बना, कैसे था? Successful rebellion against an imperial power from Delhi. How did the rulers of Vijayanagar gain legitimacy in the eyes of their people? किसका सहारा लिया उन्होंने? किसको बैसाखी बनाया? धर्म को, रिलीजन को. Therefore, they were never able to completely extricate themselves from their religious dependency. They remained highly dependent on religion for legitimacy. Now, one factor for the rigidity of the society in Vijayanagar Empire was the prevalence of the Brahmanical worldview and the Varnashram Dharma system, which it was not easy to overcome. क्यों? Because not only did it involve going against entrenched Brahmanical interests, by acting against them, the ruling class would also have acted against its own class interests, क्योंकि वो भी ब्राह्मण्स ही थे, right? So Brahmanical interests were too powerful to be undone by a single ruler, and secondly, challenging Brahmanical superiority would have harmed the interests of the ruling class itself. ओके, क्लियर है? और क्या फैक्टर्स बताओ, सोचो सोचो, और क्या हो सकता है? अरे उनके एक एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन में कोई ऐसा फीचर दिख रहा है विच मे हैव एक्टेड एज एन इम्पेडिमेंट टू प्रोग्रेस? एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव मैकेनिज्म में कुछ ऐसी चीज दिख रही है कि राजा की अथॉरिटी को जो चैलेंज करे और राजा का जो भी सोशल रिफॉर्म एजेंडा है, नॉट रूलिंग क्लास, एक नया ग्रुप इमर्ज हो रहा था ना, टॉप मिलिट्री लीडरशिप नोन एज दी अमरनायकास. अमरनायकास फ्यूडल एलिमेंट्स हैं, और फ्यूडलिज्म हमेशा किसको सपोर्ट करेगा? इंडिविजुअल फ्रीडम को या फिर रिस्ट्रिक्शंस को? रिस्ट्रिक्शंस को, राइट? सो द इंक्रीजिंगली feudal setup presented a natural and strong challenge against any reformative agenda. ठीक? अच्छा. Fourthly, Vijayanagar rulers, one way in which they generated support among the general population was to patronize and give grants to the construction of new temples, right? और टेम्पल्स को किस तरह की ग्रांट्स दी जाती थी? लैंड ग्रांट्स नोन एज मान्या लैंड, राइट? सिमिलरली Amarnayakas were rewarded in the form of, paid in the form of Amaram land, right? Now, in order to gain more and more popularity and support from the temples, from priestly class and the Amarnayakas, kings को क्या करना जरूरी था? To continuously and increasingly keep on rewarding these groups, Amarnayakas and temples. तो इनको मान्य और अमरम लैंड और ज्यादा देते रहना है. अब लैंड किसी भी रीजन में फाइनाइट ही होगा, राइट? इन ऑर्डर टू अक्वायर न्यू लैंड क्या करना पड़ेगा? जंग लड़नी पड़ेगी या फिर दूसरे का लैंड खरीदना पड़ेगा, राइट? दैट काइंड ऑफ स्टफ वुड हैव टू बी डन. एंड बिकॉज ऑफ दिस, ये जो ग्रुप्स हैं, दे इमर्ज्ड एज एन इंपॉर्टेंट प्रेशर ग्रुप, प्रेशराइजिंग द किंग्स टू अंडरटेक एन अग्रेसिव फॉरेन पॉलिसी. And just to their north were their main rivals con Bahmanis, and Bahmanis were Muslim power, were a Muslim power. Therefore, the relationship between the Vijayanagara Empire and the Bahmani kingdom is often seen through the lens of religion, but it also had powerful economic interest vested behind it, and that is why the Vijayanagara rulers were never able to extract themselves. They were not able to permanently pursue a policy of peace with the Bahmanis, right? And because of this what happened, ये जो religious identity और religious conflict वाला angle है, ये और ज्यादा strong होता गया, and this also increased the dependency of the ruling class on religion, thus preventing the effectiveness of its modernization project. क्लियर? अच्छा, एंड फाइनली जो ये ऑपरेसिव प्री मॉडर्न सिस्टम था विजयनगर एम्पायर की सोसाइटी में, what should it be perceived as? Was it some superficial system that had recently been introduced, or was it a system that had evolved over several thousands of years and had widespread acceptability at the very bottom, very lowest levels of the society? Very lowest levels पर भी उसकी acceptability थी. This kind of system was ingrained into the popular consciousness. It was considered to be rightful, legitimate, and उसको ओवरकम करना किसी भी रूलिंग क्लास का के लिए पॉसिबल था नहीं, स्पेशली अ प्री मॉडर्न रूलिंग क्लास विद लिमिटेड एबिलिटी टू ट्रांसलेट इट्स पॉलिसीज इनटू रियलिटी. तो पॉलिसी तो हो सकता है कि टॉप लेवल पे बन जाए, लेकिन उसका ट्रांसमिसिबिलिटी हमेशा कम रहेगा. व्हाई? क्योंकि एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव ऑर्गेनाइजेशन उतना एफिशिएंट नहीं है, सोशल बेस ऑफ द किंगडम उतना लार्ज नहीं है. A bulk of the population feels like they are mute spectators to high level political development जो कि हो रहे हैं. They feel they have no say in the polity, no say in the administration, and that is why policy transmission remains weak. So it was inherently difficult for any pre-modern state to radically transform an entrenched system of social organization that enjoys religious sanction. ठीक? And these were the reasons why the Vijayanagar rulers failed to bring about any meaningful change in the society even though they tried. Clear? What was the question? एक बार दोबारा लिख देता हूं. क्या क्वेश्चन था? Now आपको जो मेन बॉडी में आर्ग्यूमेंट्स करने हैं वो तो समझ में आ गए हैं. लेट अस नाउ लुक एट द स्ट्रक्चर ऑफ योर आंसर. क्या क्या पार्ट्स होंगे आंसर के, कैसे उनको ऑर्गेनाइज करना है. इन द इंट्रोडक्शन किसके बारे में बात करनी चाहिए? हाँ, रूलर्स का अटेम्प्ट टू चेंज दी सोसाइटी. तो जो पिछले वाले क्वेश्चन को डिस्कस करने के लिए हमने कुछ पॉजिटिव डेवलपमेंट्स देखे थे, वो आपको यहाँ पे मेंशन करने चाहिए. सेलेक्टिवली आप मेंशन करोगे, डोंट नीड टू मेंशन एवरीथिंग. हाँ, 5 पॉइंट जो थे. राइट? इसके बाद क्या करना पड़ेगा इंट्रो में ही? नेक्स्ट पोर्शन पता है ना क्या होगा? क्या नेक्स्ट पोर्शन में आपको बात करनी है? फैक्टर्स फॉर लिमिटेड सक्सेस. तो यहां पे बीच में क्या बताना पड़ेगा कि भाई अटेम्प्ट तो किया है लेकिन इसका सक्सेस लिमिटेड है. राइट? ये दोनों पोर्शन, ये दोनों चीजें आप इंट्रोडक्शन में बता दोगे. देन यू आर गोइंग टू मूव ऑन. यू आर गोइंग टू डिस्कस द वेरियस फैक्टर्स. ये जितने भी 6-7 फैक्टर्स हैं इनको आप डिस्कस करोगे. एंड देन यू आर गोइंग टू मूव टुवर्ड्स द conclusion. On what note should you be concluding this answer? Last factor आपने क्या लिखा है? That it was difficult for any pre-modern state to radically transform an entrenched system of social organization that enjoys religious sanction. Conclusion आप क्या करोगे? Yes, that is one way in which you can conclude कि यूरोप में यही जो प्रोजेक्ट है that succeeded, उसके क्या फैक्टर्स थे उससे आप कंपेयर कर सकते हो. तो that is one way of concluding. Any other way of concluding? रूलर्स पर रूलिंग ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ ट्रेडिशन. तो ये तो आप वहीं पे वापस चले गए. शुड यू नॉट बी लुकिंग एट द फॉरवर्ड लिंकेज ऑफ दिस आंसर. तो भाई फेलियर हुआ है, उसका रिजल्ट आप बता सकते हो कंक्लूजन में कि फेल्ड अटेम्प्ट हुआ एंड रिजल्ट ऑफ दिस फेलियर वाज दैट द विजयनगर सोसाइटी रिमेन्ड अ डिस्टिंक्टली medieval society. This was one of the factors behind its disintegration later on. Later जो future generations over the next centuries, they were enslaved by the British because they were radically backward as compared to the British. तो इस तरह से आप forward linkages भी draw कर सकते हो. In fact, that I think would be the most appropriate way. इसका impact क्या हुआ कि अगर ये attempt succeed होता, ये factors नहीं exist करते, तो क्या रियलिटी हो सकती थी, नहीं हुआ तो उसकी वजह से क्या हो रहा है. ठीक है. तो दैट इज ऑल फॉर टुडे. सोसाइटी हमने कवर कर लिया है, कल्चर हमको डिस्कस करना है, दैट वी आर गोइंग टू डू इन आवर नेक्स्ट क्लास. ठीक है. एनी डाउट्स? समझ में आया है? चलिए, थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम. हाँ, उसके बाद बहमनी होगा, कल्चर के बाद बहमनी होगा, फिर उसके बाद भक्ति सूफी होगा. क्या क्या? हाँ हाँ, बस बात वही है ना कि कितनी फीमेल्स को राइट टू एजुकेशन था. वाज द राइट टू एजुकेशन अवेलेबल टू फीमेल्स एट द सेम रेट दैट इट वाज अवेलेबल टू मेल्स? क्या स्कूल्स में उतनी ही लड़कियां पढ़ रही थी जितने की लड़के पढ़ रहे थे? तो ये भी तो आपको देखना पड़ेगा. या फिर केवल एक माइक्रोस्कोपिक पोर्शन पढ़ रहा था वुमेन का, राइट? एंड वर दी इवन अलाउड एंट्री इनटू टेंपल्स, वर दी इवन अलाउड एंट्री इनटू स्कूल्स, या फिर उनको जो नॉर्मल स्कूल यार्ड है उसके बाहर उनके घर में कोई ना कोई पढ़ा रहा था? ये भी आपको देखना पड़ेगा. You will find out that a very small group of highly elite women from a very cultured background were given access to education. और वो भी उस लेवल का एजुकेशन नहीं जैसे कि मेल्स को दिया जा रहा था. They are going to be given cultural education, for example डांस, म्यूजिक, ये सब करना सिखाया जाएगा, पेंटिंग वगैरह बनाना सिखाया जाएगा. Maybe some poetry is going to be taught to them. Maybe some other cultural activity they are going to be trained in. Men को on the other hand, they were being prepared for a complete holistic life as it was imagined by the scholars of that period. उनको religious और secular education का complete mixture provide किया जा रहा था. Women were not being given the same kind of access to education. ठीक है. So that is why हम, हाँ, you are correct in saying कि आपको एक mixed reality मिलती है. That is why we have qualified ना. Women of condition of women was poor, but it was relatively better than women in North India. That is why. लेकिन फिर भी पुअर ही था. आया नहीं है अभी तक. ऑब्वियसली आ सकता है, लेकिन अगर वुमेन के ऊपर क्वेश्चन आएगा ना तो इट विल बी ऑन कंडीशन ऑफ वुमेन इन मेडिवल इंडिया, नॉट विजयनगर. ठीक है. तो वहां पे आपको सल्तनत पीरियड का, बहमनी किंगडम में, विजयनगर एम्पायर में, इसमें कंपैरिजन हो सकता है, करना पड़े. वहां पे क्या कंडीशन था, यहाँ पे क्या कंडीशन हुआ, व्हाट वर द चेंजेस दैट वर विजिबल. मुगल पीरियड भी आएगा तो कंडीशन ऑफ वुमेन. अच्छा, वुमेन इन अर्बन एनवायरनमेंट, वुमेन इन रूरल एनवायरनमेंट, वुमेन अमंग मुस्लिम्स, वुमेन अमंग हिंदूज, वुमेन अमंग लोअर कास्ट हिंदूज, वुमेन अमंग अपर कास्ट हिंदूज. इस बेसिस पे आपको कंपैरिजन करना पड़ेगा. लैंग्वेज, जितने जितने डायमेंशंस आप अपने आंसर में घुसाओगे ना, जितने यूनिट्स ऑन विच कंपैरिजन कैन बी डन, द आंसर इज गोइंग टू बी दैट मच मोर कंप्लीट, दैट मच रिचर, उसमें आपको मार्क्स भी अवार्ड होंगे एट द एंड। ठीक है, चलिए, नो फर्दर डाउट्स, समझ में आया है आज क्लास में जो हुआ है? ऑलराइट, थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम। ऋतुजा, आई होप देयर आर नो डाउट्स। उनका अलग से रोल तो नहीं, देवर यूजली मास्टर्स ऑफ तेलुगु लिटरेचर। तो ऐसा बोला जाता है दैट इट वाज ड्यूरिंग द विजयनगर एम्पायर दैट तेलुगु लिटरेचर इमर्ज्ड आउट ऑफ द शैडो ऑफ संस्कृत लिटरेचर। इसके पहले ऐसा नहीं है दैट तेलुगु लिटरेचर वाज नॉट बीइंग कंपोज्ड, लेकिन दीज वर सिंपल ट्रांसलेशंस ऑफ प्री एग्जिस्टिंग संस्कृत टेक्स्ट। तो ओरिजिनल जेन्युइन वर्क्स, ऑथेंटिक वर्क्स नहीं क्रिएट हो रहे थे। कृष्णदेवराय ने क्या किया? He encouraged a number of Telugu scholars to compose a large body of Telugu literature during his time period. तो Telugu today is recognized as one of the classical languages of India ना, तो ये classical language का status उसको इसी period में मिला, विजयनगर एम्पायर में ही उसको मिला, because of the great degree of patronage. The systems of Telugu literature, उसके grammar, syntax etc., they were all systematized during this period. ठीक है, तो कंप्लीट रूल्स बने, ओरिजिनल बॉडी ऑफ लिटरेचर क्रिएट किया गया। इट ऑल्सो बिकेम अ रीजनली वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट आइडेंटिटी मार्कर फॉर पीपल ऑफ द तेलुगु स्पीकिंग रीजन, राइट। उसके बाद आंध्रा स्टेट बना, फिर उसके बाद उसमें भी विभाजन हुआ, तेलंगाना स्टेट बना। तो तेलुगु का इंपॉर्टेंस इस पीरियड से इमर्ज होना शुरू होता है। बिफोर दिस इट वॉज अ सबसेट ऑफ तमिल लिटरेचर, और उसके पहले इट वाज अंडर द शैडो ऑफ संस्कृत लिटरेचर। बट नाउ तेलुगु लिटरेचर का, तेलुगु लैंग्वेज का इंपॉर्टेंस बढ़ना अब शुरू हो जाएगा। क्लासिकल एज ऑफ तेलुगु लिटरेचर, लेकिन वहां पे गुप्ता एज में क्वेश्चन ये था, शुड द गुप्ता एज बी कंसिडर्ड अ गोल्डन एज ऑफ हिस्ट्री ऑफ इंडियन हिस्ट्री और सिंपली अ क्लासिकल एज ऑफ संस्कृत लिटरेचर, राइट। तो वो ऐसा तो हम बोल नहीं रहे हैं ना कि विजयनगर एम्पायर वाज द गोल्डन एज ऑफ इंडियन हिस्ट्री। तो आई डोंट थिंक दैट क्वेश्चन रिमेन्स वैलिड। अगर कोई स्टैंड अलोन क्वेश्चन आता है ऑन तेलुगु लिटरेचर, दैट मे वेरी वेल बी पॉसिबल, 10 नंबर का क्वेश्चन आपको आ सकता है, बट इट इज नॉट गोइंग टू बी ओनली अबाउट तेलुगु लिटरेचर, because Vijayanagara rulers patronized not only Telugu literature but also Tamil literature, Malayalam literature, Kannada literature, even Sanskrit literature to a large degree. कई जगहों पर Persian scholars were also given patronage, right? तो क्वेश्चन आएगा तेलुगु लिटरेचर के ऊपर, बट वंस अगेन इट इज गोइंग टू बी कंपैरेटिव। वहां पे आपको बाकी लैंग्वेजेस में जो डेवलपमेंट हुआ है उसके बारे में भी बात करनी पड़ेगी। इट इज नॉट गोइंग टू बी ओनली डीलिंग विद तेलुगु लिटरेचर। ओके, चलिए, थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम।